Reflections on Peasant and Capitalist Morality. It's obvious that whether we regard it as superstructure or infrastructure, the moral world of a society will have to fit with the economic, social and political worlds. If we believe that there is a real difference between peasant and capitalist social formations in their socio-economic structures, we should find a difference in their moral systems, which of course deeply influences their economic and social behaviour, and particularly their strategies. In this paper, I will first provide a very brief ideal type sketch of a few of the features of peasant and capitalist morality, distilled from a number of monographs and analyses of peasantry, and my own work on English villages from the 15th to the 18th centuries. Then I will throw out a few suggestions as to what might explain the differences. Two ways in which one might approach a sketch of moral systems are by considering the levels of morality and the boundaries of morality. So firstly, the levels of morality. The embeddedness of morality, to use Polanyi's phrase, is not exactly the moral economy, but more the morality of the economy. In other words, the questions of whether people are to be treated as means or ends, whether the ends of behaviour are economic or social. The basic message of Chayanov is really that the ends in peasant societies are social. The productive efforts are the means to those ends. Only capitalist societies have turned the means into ends. Quote from Sombart: "The transvaluation of values in modern times is also apparent in the habit of regarding the means to any end as the end itself." This is part of the association of social and economic, the breaking of which Weber thought one of the major features of capitalism. The pursuit of economic ends, profit, as an end in itself, is immoral in a society where the separation of economy and society has not occurred. One general impression that comes through strongly if we look at the English evidence from the 15th century onwards is the degree to which, from a very early period, there is a moral system governing economic behaviour. Certain actions and attitudes are just, right, praiseworthy. But this morality changes in only small ways through the centuries. That is to say, it's difficult, certainly at the local level, to find evidence of a revolutionary transformation of economic morality. We might have expected, at the start of the period I'm considering, say 1400, to have witnessed economic behaviour embedded in social and religious constraints. We would have expected many capitalist, as it were, practices and attitudes to be forbidden and penalised. For example, the central features of interest and acquisition. Gradually, we would have expected, as in the analyses of Max Weber and R.H. Tawney, the rules should be changed so that people were now free, inverted commas, to pursue their economic objectives. E.P. Thompson tried to resurrect this notion in a mild way in relation to the 18th century. In his article on the moral economy of the crowd, he wrote, "It's difficult to reimagine the moral assumptions of another social configuration. It's not easy for us to conceive that there may have been a time, within a smaller and more integrated community, when it appeared to be unnatural that any man should profit from the necessities of others. End of quote. As the rules changed, so we might have expected a shift in the nature of the game. People who had before tried to maximize social and ritual goals, perhaps, would now try to maximize economic profit in a rational, that is, a Weberian way. At the same time, we would have expected a transformation of a moral economy appropriate to peasantry, with communal and family restraints, to one based on the individual. Yet insofar as we can see behind the documents, there is little trace of this revolutionary shift. It's difficult to see any obvious universal movement, with all the rules and ends of behaviour changing dramatically. At the start, it would seem, land and labour were treated as commodities on the market. Their use and acquisition were, of course, subject to rules about what was acceptable, and hence economics, as it always is, was embedded in morality. But it was not an embedding of a different kind from that today. In other words, there was not a sea of kinship or religion which prevented accumulation, C-S-E-A. The same rules that governed behaviour in the 15th century, as far as we can see, were those that governed it in the 18th or 19th centuries. According to Sombart, in capitalism, quote, the natural world, with its fullness of life, has been shattered to atoms. On its ruins, an artificial world of dead matter has been erected by human ingenuity. This is related to Max Weber's disenchantment of the world. Basically, this is about the relations between economics and religion, or between the everyday world of practical action and the supernatural world. As Margaret Mead puts it, quote, in many cultures throughout the world, man is continuous with his environment. End of quote. There is an idea that the universe cares, is morally significant. Put in another way by Beals in his work on the Indian village of Gopalpur, there is no sharp line of demarcation between gods, men and animals in an Indian village. This almost universal belief in an interpenetrating moral world is believed to have existed in medieval Europe. As Mark Bloch put it in The Royal Touch, there was an absence of natural and supernatural barriers in medieval religion. In the Middle Ages, quote, the two worlds interpenetrate one another, end of quote. A very frequent correlate of this is that social discord brings divine retribution. This almost universal belief, found in Greek thought, according to Dodds in his book Greeks and the Irrational, and in many areas of the world where, for instance, it's thought that quarrels will disturb the crops, as Fiora Heimendorf describes of the Sherpas, that disease and social tensions are linked, as Horton and many others have argued. This view might be expected. There are hints of such beliefs in 17th century England, as there are today. Thus clerics warned that swearing might bring illness and plague. Others thought that thunder and lightning might be sent by God to prevent a man sending his beast onto the commons. Keith Thomas has given other instances of the way in which the material environment and man's moral behaviour were linked. Yet if we look at local evidence and literary evidence from the 16th century, what is most striking in England is the degree to which natural and supernatural had become separated, and morality was a thing of this world. There are hints of a link in Ralph Josselin's 17th century diary, but he was a pious man. In the extensive court records and other sources we've used, there is little evidence of such a linkage. While the anthropologist Hobin argues that the concept of the morality of the universe disappears in periods of great social change, and one might apply this to the 16th to the 18th centuries, it seems more likely that already the nexus between nature and man had been cut by the utilitarian attitudes towards the natural world. The disenchantment of the world had already set in before the period which are covered in our records, that is from the 15th century. This is all very far from the world which Robert Redfield described in The Peasant View of the Good Life. Quote, "For him," in other words the peasant, "divinity is in all nature, and the farmer walks on holy ground. Farming is practical action suffused with religious feeling." End of quote. There is little trace of this in Josselin's diary or other 16th or 17th century sources as far as I can see. It's been noted for a long time by anthropologists and others that envy, jealousy, the idea that one person's gain is another's loss, is a central feature of peasant societies. Margaret Mead noted that, quote, "Titles, powers, prestige and wealth are considered quantitatively finite. Hence, the gains of one person are viewed as reducing the prospects of others." We're told that the concept of limited good, as it's called, is intrinsic to Chinese thought. Maurice Friedman and Mary Douglas have both argued. Is widespread in India, according to Oscar Lewis, and so on. It manifests itself in a number of ways, as Foster has shown in his well-known article on the ethic of limited good. There is a fear of praise. To praise something is bound to be insincere, since one does not feel it in one's heart, and hence close to an admission of envy, and hence close to witchcraft. Quote, "The person who compliments is in fact guilty of aggression. He is telling someone to his face that he is rising above the dead level that spells security for all, and he is suggesting that he may be confronted with sanctions." This is in Potter's book on peasant society. Furthermore, there is a fear of ostentation. There is a systematic understatement of wealth, according to Bailey's book on caste in India, and a belief that the rich must have become so through evil means, through a stroke of good fortune, finding a pot of gold hidden in their fields, for example, at the best, through the help of the devil at the worst. Quote, "Large accumulations of wealth may cause death without apparent cause," according to Gardner. Quote from Audrey Richards' Land and Labour, "To be much better off than his fellows would be dangerous," end of quote, and must have been achieved by witchcraft. It's believed that the interests of unrelated families are mutually destructive. If one rises, another must fall, according to John Campbell's book on the Greek. Summarizing this, Robert Redfield notes that in the peasant view of the good life, quote, "Wealth is to be held within decent limits. It's not to be thrown about or too obtrusively vaunted." Now, it would not be difficult to find hints of this idea today or in the 17th century. Envy, relative deprivation, a fear of being exposed are always present even in affluent capitalist societies. Thus, for example, one finds at the higher theoretical levels in the philosophy of money, implicit in the mercantilist period of the 17th and 18th century, the idea that one country's gain was another's loss. As Francis Bacon, the philosopher, wrote of trade, "For whatsoever is somewhere gotten is somewhere lost." It was Adam Smith's achievement to show that this was not necessarily so. The economic charter for unlimited good and competition, leading to an ever-expanding economy, was laid down by Smith. But the change came quite late. There were signs of a belief that resources were limited and one person's prosperity was always linked to the bad luck of another. Envy was a powerful and widespread emotion. Even in small ways, people had to be careful. Too much mirth and laughter could lead to misfortune. This is clearly linked to a central theme in Greek thought, namely that of hubris, or pride before a fall. But what is strange is relatively how little evidence there is of what economists call a zero-sum game or mentality, a world of limited good. Of course, it continued in force on the Celtic fringes of the British Isles, as described by travellers in those areas. Or, as de Tocqueville pointed out, in much of Ancien Régime Europe, quote, "They were all trained to envy, delation and hatred," end of quote. It may have reasserted itself in the depopulated villages of 19th century Britain. For instance, in the Oxfordshire villages described by Flora Thompson, where, quote, "their ideal for themselves and their children was to keep to the level of the normal," end of quote. And another quote from her, "There was nothing they disliked more than seeing one of their number doing better or having more of anything than themselves," end of quote. This led to great conformity, and the final quote, "You can't afford to be on bad terms with anybody in a small place like this," end of quote. They remind one of the frogs in a well of Indian proverb, who pull each other down if they try to escape, preferring to be all in shared misery. Yet if we turn to the diaries, letters, court cases and other evidence for the 16th to 19th centuries, for the majority of the population there is singularly little of this. Of course there is backbiting and scolding in some of the court cases, but ostentatious differences of wealth were encouraged and tolerated. The high social mobility of different members of the family or community was widespread. People were keen to become richer and better educated and to show it. It's a different world from that of what we hear in many peasantries. I now want to turn to the other main area, the boundaries of morality. Morality stretches as far as social relations. A shared moral universe is usually limited to the boundaries of particular arenas. Thus, most societies have a system of separate moralities. As the sociologist George Simmel puts it, quote, "The earliest phase of social formations found in historical as well as in contemporary social structures is this: a relatively small circle firmly closed against neighbours, strangers, or in some ways antagonistic or in some way antagonistic circles. The most obvious invisible boundaries are as follows. The first is the kinship boundary. While in the majority of societies there is some form or variant of amoral familism, that is, the idea that the boundaries of morality end with kinship, in early modern England there is a singular lack of evidence that the boundaries of family were the boundaries of the moral universe. Of course, in a clash, one put family interests before that of a stranger, and of course people were fond of some of their kin. Advice given in books to the sons of aristocrats no doubt warned people to beware of non-kin. But such books of advice also warn people not to borrow from their family, a strange piece of advice in many societies. It's also true that the relationship between parent and child, and particularly between husband and wife, was the model of the trusting, confident, open one, upon which the relationship with God should also be modelled. But though this was one's deepest area of trust, it did not exclude others. There appears to be little evidence that it was widely believed that outside the nuclear or close extended family there was a world filled with deception and intrigue, where lying and cheating were the order of the day. There is little impression of a world where it was one's duty, in shielding one's family, to undermine one's neighbours and friends, in inverted commas, where proper friendship was impossible and disinterested altruism inconceivable, a war of all against all, with each family competing against all others. One of the most striking and surprising features that arise from the records is the minimal degree to which the moral world was confined to the family. Soon the children would grow up and leave home, and perhaps and probably live elsewhere. Ralph Joslin's moral universe, for example, like ours, contained many more non-kin than kin. Related to this was the strange and rather uncharacteristic assumption that people could, on the whole, be trusted. The expectation of good rather than evil in social relations. That a man was what he seemed. That a man's or woman's words were to be believed. It appears that friendship could grow between people who did not know much about each other's background. It was clearly possible for uneasy familiarity to grow with complete strangers. It's difficult to think of any type of behaviour which was considered legitimate within the family as a whole, and considered illegitimate outside, and vice versa. There was not a moral world boundary at the edges of the particular social world. This helps explain some of the features of the perviousness, as it were, of the nuclear family. In one sense, the nuclear family is absorbed into and obliterated by the wider forces of market and state. It has been conquered almost entirely from the outside, though a few of the harshest bargaining features of the capitalist system are dropped on the threshold. On the other hand, the morality which has never crept out from the hearth in the beleaguered families of much of the world has, to a large extent, conquered society. To a certain level, everyone who comes within sight is a member of the family, at least of Christ. Universal politeness, respect, and even trust are marks of the true gentleman or gentlewoman. No person has entirely forfeited their humanity. All require a minimum of fairness and decency and respect for their rights and liberties. In other words, kinship and morality are not coterminous in England. We are very far from a world of amoral familism, of cosa nostra, our people, of such a desire to put the family first that kinship enters into everything through nepotism and other channels. The morality of towns and country are particularly strongly opposed in the majority of societies. As Robert Redfield puts it, the rustic sees the gentry and the town as sources of dangerous new ideas, places where doubt is cast on what the peasant believes, and where new cults and corruptions occur. Or as George Foster writes, the city with its glitter and opportunity holds a fascination like a candle for a moth. But at the same time, and for good cause, peasants hate and fear cities and city dwellers. London, in the early modern period, of course, had a special flavour. But on the whole, there is little evidence from the quite extensive studies we now have of many cities and towns that the morality of town and country was very different. It's a matter of interpretation as to whether one believes that this is urbs in rure, that is the city in the countryside, or rus in urbe, that is the countryside in the city, whether it is the conquest of the country by a bourgeois mentality, or vice versa. I incline to the former, namely that it is the conquest of the countryside by an urban morality. What is clear is that as people moved from town to country, or back again, they did not get that shock of moving between different moral universes, which is recorded for so many European and other peasantries. Again, there seems in England to have been a rather curious absence of different moral universes as between economic strata or occupational groups. Of course, if one goes to the very extremes of the wealth hierarchy, one does get a sense of difference. Thus the world of the very poor wandering vagabonds did, in a sense, form a subculture with a separate moral code. The accounts of the language and law, LORE, of wandering rogues in the Elizabethan period shows this, just as later the language and law of school children would similarly show a difference. Likewise, the very rich and powerful no doubt had their own moral codes in which honour and shame played a larger part. Yet, restricting ourselves to the 90% of the population who lived between the two extremes, two preliminary points can be made. Firstly, it's true that there are signs of a growing divergence between the moral worlds of those at the upper and lower levels, and this can be seen in 1,000 features of the material and non-material world. Yet certainly in the earlier period, and even towards the end of the 18th century, the society is still a long way from the rigid divisions one observes in most caste or estate societies. I cannot see in the evidence opposed moral worlds of the bourgeoisie, the peasantry, and the lords and the clergy. The basic premises of morality, both the rules of what was fair and reasonable and equitable, and also the feeling that all people, whatever their wealth and background, should be treated by the same rule, these were widespread. The poor might be inferior in one respect, but they were still humans, and it was sinful to cheat and lie to them. The right might be oppressive, but it was not immediately assumed that they were entirely without scruple. That is, the mighty might be oppressive. The idea of noblesse d'oblige, the obligation of nobility, of the public duty of the gentry, of public offices trying to do good for the community, of duties to the Commonwealth, are all expressions of this. When we consider the village evidence in England, the most striking fact is the absence of two moral universes between men and women. This could be documented in relation to the ideals of female behaviour and male behaviour in dress, language, sexual morality, and so on. What is striking is that the secluded and differentiated world of women and men, each with their own moral rules and scarcely touching each other, which is a central feature of societies from the New Guinea highlands through to Hindu and Muslim peasantries, and even to Catholic and Celtic ones, seems conspicuously absent in England. The explicit opposition of men and women in symbolism, for example, the sheep and goat metaphors of the Sarakatsani shepherds described by John Campbell, and the constant war of the sexes, is minimized. Of course, in witchcraft, in fears of the monstrous regiment of women, in the strutting and sexual innuendo of courtiers, we find traces of some opposition. But from Chaucer to the Brontes, and from high to low, what is unusual about this civilization, as de Tocqueville noted for America as well, was the easy and relaxed attitude between the sexes. Just as in law, unmarried women were equal to men, and in religion they were equal before the Protestant God, despite jibes that women had no souls, so in morality they lived on the same moral plane as men. There was not one moral law for men and another for women, and the double standards were restricted to pragmatic matters of inheritance and the confusion of heirs, as in the question of adultery. The morality of different regions is usually very different in peasant societies. What is praiseworthy in the fenland is not necessarily what is right in the upland or the champion country. The morality of shepherds is not the same as that of settled farmers. One might, therefore, have expected the moral universe of two places that I studied in depth, upland, Cumbrian, Kirby Lonsdale, and the lowlands of Essex in the village of Earl's Cone, to be totally different. Though it's difficult to prove, there's little indication of this in any of the quite extensive documentation I've looked at. Unless it's the homogenizing effects of the records themselves, there is little trace in the various local histories of various parts of England one looks at, nor even in contemporary accounts such as the famous History of Middle, Myddle, that there were deep moral differences between parts of England. A patchwork quilt of small geographical areas, each inhabited by half-closed moral worlds, is not applicable to England. There is a curious homogeneity. Just as the wider geographical world seems to have been spread out with a more or less even morality, so at a lower level, morality seems to spread itself evenly over the space of a single parish. We can see this, for instance, in the contrasts of sacred and profane space. Although there were, of course, mildly sacred spaces like the altar, the heavily emphasized differences which one finds, for example, in Catholic or Celtic societies, with their grottos, holy wells and fountains, dangerous areas where spirits prowl, is almost totally absent in England. Of course, folklorists have found slight echoes of the enchanted and magical otherworld, which usually interpenetrates with this material one, but they are relatively slight and summarized by Keith Thomas in his book on Religion and the Decline of Magic. If one had asked a contemporary whether there were certain areas of a parish where it was permissible to do things and others where it was not, it would be difficult to find examples. Space was to a large extent uniform, the flat and morally neutral setting for man's existence, a level playing field in the modern cliché. Likewise, time was largely without moral heights and depths. Despite attempts to find traces of a Durkheimian ritual calendar which gives different periods of time an uneven character, there is little evidence that this is the case in the English village records. Of course, the church calendar did give a different quality to the times of feast and fast, to Lent and to Easter and to Christmas, to the holy days and to the Sabbath. There is something in this. But when we contrast this with the peaks and troughs of time in many traditional peasantries, whether in India, Europe or China, the nuances in England are restrained and mild. It could be argued that this was a result of the Protestant purging of the superstitions of Catholicism, and certainly they emphasized this tendency, that is, Protestants. Yet it would seem that time had already been evened out well before the Reformation. In order to relate this directly to morality, it does not seem that certain behavior was morally permissible at certain times and not at others. An interesting index of this is the almost total absence of ritual and moral inversion. For example, the times of moral license, when the normal rules do not hold. The Feast of Love, or Holi, in India, or Lent and Carnival in southern Europe, are conspicuous by their absence. There is no trace of the Feast of Fools, the Boy Bishop, times of license and so on, in either of the two parishes I've studied. Probably the closest to these phenomena were the muted celebrations of May, erecting of the maypole and dancing with the notorious, though as yet demographically unsubstantiated, sexual excesses. Ralph Jocelyn complained about this in Earl's Cone, but there is little evidence of riotous behaviour in other sources. Also at Christmas there is some evidence that the usual rules were a little modified, but as today, only slightly. I want to conclude by giving some preliminary thoughts on the explaining this phenomenon, this curious difference. because the deeper question is how one explains the set or cluster of features of morality which seem to be different in England. Among my first guesses would be the following. Firstly, moral rules tend to stretch as far as the boundaries of effective communication. In the majority of societies, this tends to be the family, or little community as it's known. But by the 15th century in England, through high mobility, a common language, a common law, widespread use of money and paper, the flow of communication at every level was quite considerable. Hence the moral communities tended to be bounded by the nation, or even Europe. Today, with global communications, the expansion has been from the nation to the whole world. Secondly, moral rules have an entirely different set of features depending on the basic units of the society. Typically, peasantries are based on the domestic mode of production, which is based on a familial basic unit. The moral rules are coterminous with this basic unit, or the slightly higher level of a group of co-residing units, the little community or village. This is a world where the social and economic, and the ritual and the political boundaries are still the same. In such a world, it's not surprising that the moral boundary which supports the interconnections should be aligned with this. But in a situation where the disassociations have occurred, where, in theory at least, the family is one thing, the economy another, the polity a third, and religion a fourth, one enters an entirely different moral world. Here one has the individual as the only locus of the interconnections. Only the individual is the focus of all the different spheres. And thus only the individual is a moral being. On the other hand, the surprising trade-off is that if the individual is a moral being, to be treated as such, he/she must treat others in the same way. Do as you would be done by becomes the philosophy. It's not possible to envisage a moral hierarchy. This is carried to its furthest extremes in America, as described by de Tocqueville. Then there is the fact that the nature of morality is also altered very much by the separation off of the supernatural from the natural world. If the two are interfused, as in the magical universes of most societies, then a moral lapse will reap a mystical punishment. But the disenchantment of the world is one of the most basic features of capitalism, and hence in a single-dimensional world, without miracles, without proper ritual, without taboo, with only the blind clockmaker, moral lapses can only be dealt with as forms of breaches of etiquette, in other words, of social relations, if minor, or criminal offences against the state, if serious. The nature of morality must also be deeply affected by commoditization. This is the basis or the burden of some of the works of Karl Marx and later of Marshall Sahlins. When land and labour are directly linked to the worker, then one can see how they are endowed with morality. Perhaps this is the basic requisite for the magical worldview, the interpenetration of spheres. Once the intervening layers of private property, paper, money, high mobility, and all those features which lead to alienation in the Marxist sense have been inserted, then the umbilical cord, which is what no doubt Marx would call it, is cut and the morality fades. Perhaps the clue lies more in the ways in which the productive and consuming units are linked. In slash and burn, Swidden cultures, there is usually a finite ceiling on wants, what Marshall Salins describes as the affluent society, and there are plenty of means to attain what one wants or needs. There is little sense of constriction. Developing some of Salins's and Foster's ideas and putting them together, we might distinguish three major situations. In hunters-gatherer societies and Swidden societies, the ends, what you need, are limited. Your means to those ends are more or less unlimited, and you have affluence in simplicity. In many peasant societies and herders, your ends are quite limited, but so are your means. You can't really attain much surplus, and so you have the ethic of limited good. And in capitalist societies, your ends are unlimited. You are constantly pursuing more and more good things and profits. The means, though, are expanding, but perhaps not fast enough, so you have what you might call scarcity in plenty. And we might add, in communist societies, the ends are unlimited, the means are limited, and so you have frustration and ultimately revolution. In peasant landed societies, already there is a shortage of means to attain the goals of the society. Extra effort and cunning often do not pay off, as the landlord creams off the surpluses. It's a moral world of watchfulness. Furthermore, since much of our thought is relative, the advance of one neighbouring family or group is a relative deprivation, even if not an absolute one. The situation changes in several major respects in a capitalist modern society. Firstly, the wants are still infinite and unattainable, but they are moving away like the rainbow's end, rather than being fixed. And individuals are in hot pursuit of them, always moving. For example, with modern technology, the amount of energy available per person increases year by year, so that each person feels richer, is richer, even though relative to others or to his goals, he or she never seems to be rich enough. It's a moving escalator situation, rather than the peasant standing on the bottom rung of a ladder. Secondly, with high geographical mobility and increasing compartmentalization, it's possible for there to be sufficient social distance for people to be allowed to move. In many societies, the success of one family member or one family causes distress to others. One's nose is rubbed in the mud. The cost of no man being an island, and that all are part of a continent, is that if a part of the continent shifts, the whole continent shifts. If we decide to toll the bell, to advance dramatically, then the sound deafens and irritates those around one, and various measures are used to bring the individual back into line, as in many schools where the SWAT, or the hard-working student, is penalized. Of course, all societies and groups have such pressures, but the morality of conformity, attack on greed and so on, is particularly strong, it would seem, in the middle stage societies, which are often in the worst of all positions. Tribal peoples can attain most of their goals because their goals are limited. Capitalist people can feel that if only they strive a little harder, they can attain their goals. Only peasants know that they are condemned to a life of eternal deprivation, and that the best they can do is to stop anyone from escaping from the mud. A mentality which we find also in many closed institutions like prisoner of war camps, bad schools, bad universities, and so on. Specifically, turning to the problem of limited good, there are several possible explanations for this philosophy. One theory is the materialist one. The good really is limited and everyone can see it. Hence the morality reflects a real situation. Like Bacon, they thought that one person's gain was another's loss. In this interpretation, it's sustained economic growth and the application of new technology and power which will give peasants the confidence to break out of such a worldview. A little of this applies to England in the period I'm studying. It's obvious that from the 15th to the 19th century, with some short intervals, people were, year by year, on the whole, growing richer as economic performance outstripped population growth. Tony Wrigley thinks there was a growth of about 0.25% per annum on average, which sounds low to us, but sustained over 3 centuries is quite a lot. This is an unusual situation in most societies, and it is particularly unusual that the benefit should have gone to the mass of the population, rather than being creamed off, as in India, China, and so on, by the elite. So there were grounds for expansiveness. Another theory is a social structural one. One's feelings of limitation are linked to the nature of social groups and individual ties. Basically, in a society which is based on status groups and real communities, each movement of one person affects the others. The bell that tolls for others at death also tolls at their promotion, the birth of a boy son, the high productivity of a field, a windfall. Hence we all feel involved, and people feel ambivalent at others' success or triumphant at their failure. Schadenfreude. Furthermore, within the community, even though wealth may be expandable, other things are definitely finite. For instance, power or reputation. Much of this fighting within a zero-sum game atmosphere of bounded groups emerges from this fact that reputation and power are limited. Another's rise in power or prestige is necessarily one's own loss. Hence the obsession in many societies with honour and shame, with aggressive protection of the reputation of the group. For strange reasons as yet unexplained, 17th century villagers were a long way from this. We do not find it in Gough's History of Middle or Jocelyn's Earl's Cone. The political community did not overlap with the residential community. the religious community, did not overlap with the family. As a result, people could move up or down without threatening each other in the normal way. A person could be a dutiful younger brother and yet Lord Mayor of London. There was moral space for movement and individuality. Even women were given a certain amount of space. This is all very unusual. My hunch, and to a large extent this is confirmed, is that the only other major civilization where we find this is in Japan. Put in other words, a contractual society, in Sir Henry Maine's sense, will not suffer from the image of limited good in the way that a status-based, birth-based society will. Thus, it is as much the social organization as the material world that determines this feature, as we see with hunters and gatherers who often live in an original affluent society, unafflicted by the image of limited good and, to a considerable extent, going their own way, individualistic and contractual, leaving, forming groups, dissolving groups, in a way which status-based societies cannot do. Let me conclude. Whatever the reason, standing towards the end of the 20th century, if we peer inside the moral worlds of a number of peasant societies, whether in the Third World, as summarized by writers on peasantries, Redfield, Foster, Woolf and others, or in accounts of peasantries in Europe, the Horse of Pride, Christ stopped at Eberly, the people of the Sierra, Pig Earth, the Irish Countryman and other books of that kind, we do get a sense of shock, of otherness. They are indeed a foreign country from our capitalist standpoint, which need a leap of imagination to understand. But when we turn to 16th century England onwards, not just local, but also national sources, though we notice differences, of course we are not in a foreign country in morality. On the continuum between the two extremes I have outlined, Earlscone is quite far towards the capitalist, individualist end, which I now inhabit. Obviously less so, say, than a commuter suburb or town now, but much more so than many a continental village, or even a Celtic community still is today. Thank you.